And I'm really excited to introduce today's final session, which focuses on the exciting role that precision fermentation, the third type of fermentation we've talked about today, is really going to help advance the alternative protein industry. So using microbial cells as the production host allows for highly scalable manufacture of virtually any ingredient that can be used to improve the sensory properties of a product. So in this session, you'll learn how some of today's leading innovators are using this technology to address those key sensory challenges and really drive mainstream consumer acceptance. I'll now turn the stage over to our moderator, Monica Watrous from Food Business News. Welcome to Monica and our panelists.
Thanks, Caroline. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the sixth and final session of today's symposium. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll take a deeper dive into the world of precision fermentation. As Caroline said, I'm Monica Watrous. I'm the managing editor of Food Business News. And I'm thrilled to moderate the following discussion. We have some of the best and brightest minds in this game-changing technology here on our panel. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and quickly introduce and get started. And we will leave time at the end of the session to answer your questions. So please use the VBox link pinned at the top of the chat to submit them and upvote at any time throughout the presentation. So first, joining us today is Leonard, Chief Technology Officer and Senior Vice President of R&D at Motif FoodWorks. Mike is formerly Vice President and Head of R&D for White Space Innovation and Commercialization at Kraft Heinz, and brings over 16 years of industrial science and technology experience to lead Motif's technical strategy and its R&D capabilities. Previously, Mike was Vice President of Process Technology for Global Snacks R&D at PepsiCo, and he held leadership roles in process and protein ingredient research, business development and strategy at IFF and DuPont Nutrition and Health. He has a proven track record of leading global teams to deliver innovation across developing and emerging markets. Thank you, Mike, for being here. Next, we have Tim Geislinger. He's the Chief Science Officer at Perfect Day, a global brand at the forefront of research, development, and production of animal-free dairy. He served as Vice President of Research and Development for Beyond Meat, where he built the entire scientific program and is the original creator of the now famous Beyond Burger. In metabolic engineering, drug design, fermentation, manufacturing, chemical biology, natural product chemistry, targeted therapeutics, protein engineering, scale-up technologies, and oncology. Thank you for being here today. And we also have Ranjan Patnaik. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Clara Foods. He's responsible for developing the technology and product platform to deliver fermentation-derived proteins and food ingredients as drop-in replacements for proteins sourced from animal farming. Previously, Ranjan spent 16 years with DuPont and has extensive experience in managing complex, global, multidisciplinary innovation ecosystems and programs that span across multiple geographies and market segments, ranging from nutrition, industrial biotechnology, materials to agriculture. So before we jump into the conversation, I just wanted to give each of you the opportunity to tell us more about your companies and the work that you're doing. Mike, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Monica, and thanks very much for having me on the panel today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So as Monica mentioned, my name is Mike Leonard. I'm the CTO of Motif FoodWorks in Boston, Massachusetts. And we're here to help enable the creation of plant-based foods that people actually crave. I think everyone would agree that there is still a gap that exists between what we're getting and what we expect as consumers with our plant-based foods. And so we believe that taking a fundamental science and technology approach to developing ingredient options to help those products really achieve their full potential is what's needed. So we're leveraging precision fermentation as a tool to do that in our toolbox, as well as other technologies, but microbial fermentation is one of the key technologies we rely on. And then we bring all that ingredient technology together in finished applications and products that really connect with consumers and the outside world. So I'll look forward to the discussion today, and thanks again for having me.
Great. Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Perfect Day?
Yeah, thank you, Monica. And again, thanks for having all of us on the panel today. It's an exciting time right now where the plant-based industry has obviously grown and it's hitting across sectors, across the value chain and across the entire geography around the world. So it's an exciting time. It hits a lot of different value structures for customers at every level. and it has the opportunity to be a majorly disruptive. And the way that we see that happening is similar to what Michael just mentioned, is creating key ingredients that enable products to be that much better in a wide variety of ways, and that ultimately serve the customer in terms of nutrition and flavor and function. And so while I was at Beyond Meat for those many years, we saw a lot of challenges with using raw materials from plants, and those challenges can be overcome through microbial fermentation, where we're creating native proteins that are able to be fully functional and have that really high nutrition without the dilution of all the other chemistry that's coming along with the plant-based ingredients. And so it can be very disruptive. It can be used as an ingredient in a wide variety of things. Today, we've scaled our first major protein, the whey proteins, coming out of that are from dairy originally, but they're coming from microbes in this case. And we're creating ice cream, we're creating yogurt, we're creating cheeses, we're creating eggs, we're creating a lot of different things because the proteins are so pure. They're over 95% pure at full scale, and they're already being tested by many CPG companies around the world. So it's an exciting time. We're already in a few different markets with our ice cream. And so right now we are production limited because we just can't make enough because it's working so well. So it really is kind of a landmark in terms of where this is going, right? It has a lot of opportunities. So we're very excited and we're very, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. All right, and Ranjan?
Yeah, and thanks, Monica, again for the opportunity. And it's always exciting to talk about eggs. And eggs has become a daily part of our lives, breakfast eggs everywhere. And what Clara Food is trying to do is produce a parallel alternative supply chain to meet the demand for egg proteins by fermentation. And that is where Clara has developed a couple of proteins that are very unique to functionality-wise in eggs, and make them available to the entire supply chain so that we don't have to be harvesting chickens to access our egg proteins. And the technology platform that we are using is very well proven, and the technological advances in microbiology, fermentation, engineering in the last 20 years is all converging to get together today to start making a dent into the supply chain of egg proteins. And we'll talk more about that as we progress through. And we are very happy to also say some of our products are already in commercial scale being produced. And therefore, the line of sight of disrupting the entire trillion egg supply chain might be much nearer than we originally thought. At least I thought a year and a half ago. So that is very exciting to be discussing that today in the panel here.
Great, thank you. All right, well, let's dive in. And I want to start with a very high level question. We learned today about all kinds of different fermentation and how they're used in the food industry. What exactly is precision fermentation as opposed to the other forms that were discussed today? And can you explain the distinction? And Tim, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that our protein is 95% pure, and that in and of itself kind of capitalizes on that difference, right? We're not making a slew of things, right, that are like, if you think of dairy milk, right, there's a lot of proteins, there's a lot of other things in there, lactose and other molecules that are in there. And so we're able to actually focus in and make individual proteins and then recombine them in a way that ultimately serves the customer. And so our microbes each make one basically product in and of themselves. And so that's very different also from plant-based protein. So when we think of pea protein or we think of soy protein, it's not one protein. It's actually a whole gamish of proteins that are coming along there for the ride. And so that's kind of where the precision comes into play, right? The opportunities that arise out of that is that the functionality is that much better. When you have a pure protein that is native in its structure, it's not surrounded by all the other things that normally come along for the ride, that tunability of that functionality and that nutritional profile can actually be that much more improved ultimately in the product. So it's, when we think of precision, it's really being able to focus in on making one essential, key ingredient that you really want to make. You don't want to have anything else coming along for the ride.
So, Mike, I like how you described this to me as factories. Can you kind of share that with the audience? How you would explain this to a person who's not as familiar with the process?
Sure, and Tim said it very well. I think it's leveraging the characteristics of certain types of microbes to act as small factories to produce ingredients that we're interested in a very selective and targeted way. So it's leveraging the innate capability of cells to metabolize nutrients in certain ways and the pathways that you can engineer in those microbes to produce entirely new products. In this case, we're producing food functional ingredients, which, as Tim mentioned, give rise to a toolbox that we as food developers haven't really had access to in the past. And that there's a big opportunity there, but there's also a big learning curve that I think our industry is going to go through as we learn to deal with some of the purer forms, the purer versions of these ingredients that normally exist in broad distributions. We've all been trained on how to formulate with the broad distributions. So figuring out how to make those small, pure fractions work is an interesting challenge from a functionality standpoint.
So Ranjan, I'm going to kick it to you. From your perspective, why is precision fermentation suddenly gaining attention and focus? What's driving this?
There are multiple factors. I think the main one is, I would say, is the supply chain, the distributed system that we have, where so many touch points and dependability in order to, as an example, an egg, to make an egg come to your table. There is an entire ecosystem involved behind the scenes to deliver that egg protein on your plate for breakfast. While on the other hand, when you look at precision fermentation, the idea, as both Mike and Tim mentioned, is very precise. You have complete transparency to the supply chain. You know exactly what ingredients you're adding to create your egg protein that you're going to consume. And therefore, there is a lot of benefit, both scientifically and also from a supply chain perspective, that we can definitely benefit from precision fermentation. And also the hidden cost that we all as consumers don't pay, the effect on climate, the effect on the planet, on the water resources. It takes about 200 gallons or 2,000 liters of water, not exactly sure how much, for a dozen of eggs to be made. So when you start thinking in those terms, the life cycle analysis of our products by precision fermentation has a lot more benefit compared to the traditional supply chains through animal farming. And I think all these factors together is kind of putting that impetus, saying that for precision fermentation is perhaps a better approach to mobilize resources to make protein.
Mm-hmm. So you each provided a brief snapshot of what each of your companies is doing on this front. Can you talk about why fermentation is the technology of choice for this type of work, and if there are any other technologies that could achieve these goals and potentially better? Mike, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I think at Motif, and I think is the case in other companies in this space, we're using microbial fermentation as a means primarily to generate animal-free ingredients that have animal ingredient characteristics. Turns out that animal proteins and other components are very functional and offer a lot of advantages if you can include those in food products. But ingredients that are hard to get, if you're looking for an animal-free source, those can be difficult to find. So microbial fermentation provides an attractive route to that for us. And so that's how we're leveraging it today. It's not the only kind of technology we're looking at in the portfolio, but when it comes to providing that animal functionality without the animal, that's where it really shines. And alternatives to doing that, I think you've seen those play out in the industry over time and how products have been formulated, trying to substitute for the performance of dairy protein or meat muscle protein. You've got some cumbersome solutions, some artificial, things with a lot of vowels in them that people don't like to talk about. Or from a formulation standpoint, you're cobbling together lots of components to interact in a certain way where really what you want is the precise performance of that animal protein that you're targeting. So other solutions exist, they're just a little more cumbersome. And we feel that when you're looking for that animal functionality, that's really one of the areas where this type of fermentation really shines.
Tim, do you have anything to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that what we're doing is, I say this in other meetings and stuff, is that we're standing on the shoulders of 40 years of technology, right? There's a lot of examples of where this technology is already being implemented, both in the food system as well as the medical system, to create solutions that you cannot obtain in any other way, right? So, I always like to say that chymosin is largely a protein that's made through the same process, and that's used to make 95% of cheese in the world. So if you eat cheese already, you're already eating proteins and enzymes that have been made in this fashion. And there's a lot of other enzymes that are used as processing aids within the food stream right now that people just aren't all that aware of. But what that does is it de-risks this process, both from a safety and regulatory perspective, in terms of how the agencies are looking at this and maybe some of the concerns that they might have. So it's a very low risk. It's also a very low risk to the customers, because the customers are, as I mentioned earlier, are already eating foods that have a lot of these components in it, or might come along for the ride in some cases from the microbes themselves. And from the previous panel, of course, there are people who are already eating the microbes in their entirety already as biomass, right? So corn is already making, their burgers out of mycelia, which are in some cases the hosts that are very similar to what we're using to make the proteins themselves. Yeah, and then on top of that is just the fact that it's a scaled technology, all these things, right? So there's a lot of infrastructure in place that allows us to bring this to market sooner than other mediums. For example, if you're going to do cellular agriculture where you're trying to grow mammalian cells to make meat, those are just a longer time scale. So we see this as a much faster way to get to market and have an impact, and kind of create that path towards other solutions in the future. And so there's a lot of opportunities here that are, I think, really critical when you think about moving from like a beyond an impossible type scenario, all the way through to improved products from nutrition and function, and then to other future products where we put them on SpaceX and go to other places and have foods of all different types coming from cell culture.
Ranjan, do you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think just to build upon the fact that everybody needs resources, be it a plant or an animal, and a fermentation in many ways is using glucose and ammonia. These are the two natural resources that we have, and then converting it into protein that we all can consume. So this is very parallel in terms of converting certain kinds of resources and upgrading it to a level of biomass or a protein. And I think fermentation in that sense can be very efficient, very precise. And that is why making proteins by fermentation can be a very compelling reason, rather than accessing through cattle growth or through any other plant system also.
Yeah. And just to build on Ranjan's point there, I mean, at Perfect Day, we're already manufacturing in Europe, Asia, and in North America, obviously. And so we're already manufacturing at full scale in these different locations. And so it's very easy to step into footprints that already exist and are utilizing carbon and nitrogen supply chains in those environments already. So it's very agnostic to those supply chains that are feeding it. And also to location, and it's also adaptive to kind of global warming issues, right? Because we can be very flexible in how we design our organisms to make foods, but also where they're located and how they're utilizing local economies and local supply chains.
Great, thank you. Another question for each of you. We'll start with Ranjan. What role do partnerships play in your approach to precision fermentation?
I couldn't hear you, Monica. Can you come again?
What role do partnerships play in your approach?
I think this is perhaps the most important piece for our technology to commercialize. I think partnerships across the entire value chain to make sure that this approach of delivering protein to mankind is accelerated and in a time scale that we all want it to happen. Commercial partnerships at the consumer end is absolutely critical. And Clara Foods is very fortunate to have Ingredient as a commercial partner, as an investor, to take the innovations and our products to market at a much more faster rate, and that accessibility that a small company like ours or an innovator like Clara Foods can do it quickly. And on the other extreme, on the ecosystem, we also have in the players in the supply chain, the fermentation assets around the world that we are leveraging to make this product makes it much easier and much easier to scale up at a price point that we all want, and also accessing the raw materials like sugars around the world or different feedstocks to convert to the proteins. Those partnerships are also getting absolutely critical. So in that way, we are very fortunate to be embracing fermentation as a platform, because the ecosystem to convert certain kinds of resources to certain products already exist. And partnerships definitely are the way to go, and is already showing results for what I would call a new technology in many sense. Alternative protein is frankly a new technology, but the reason we are all able to see its impact so quickly because these partnerships in the ecosystem exist already.
Tim?
Yeah, partnerships are critical. I just mentioned that we're working in multiple locations. A lot of those are through partnerships, and we're expanding in each of those locations as well. But it's across the entire value chain, right? All the way from the customer to the CPG companies, through the manufacturing, as well as in terms of the science and bringing the science and making it move as fast as possible. We look for partnerships. We can't do it all. And we know that in many cases, we're not the best people to do everything, right? And so partnerships are really, really important to work with people who have solved a lot of these challenges before in different scenarios, and know how to walk that path, right? And so we want plenty of people to hold our hands along the way and enable us to move not only quickly, but safely and effectively, right? And because ultimately all that translates to the customer, and that's the most important thing.
And Mike?
To echo what Tim and Ranjan has said, in this industry, you're not successful in isolation. I think it's an ecosystem, and at Motif, we're similarly intent on creating the right partnerships. Upstream, Ginkgo Bioworks is our primary partner on strain engineering and synthetic biology. They're a very close collaborator with us in determining targets and developing technology to help bring this type of fermentation to the fore. So that's critical for us, but also the downstream partnerships to actually enable offtake once the ingredients have been developed is critical. And ultimately, it's how we scale the business. I think all of us want to see these products get better and consumer adoption increase. And without the right partnerships downstream, all the benefits that come with plant-based lifestyle, we'll struggle to realize those. So you need the leverage that comes with these types of strategic partnerships.
Sure. So let's talk about the consumer, because if this technology exists to help advance the mainstream acceptance of plant-based foods, we also need to consider the consumer mindset and perception. How do you reconcile the consumer demand for clean label and ingredients they understand with something that's a little less clear when they think about fermentation and microflora and animal-free dairy, for example? So Tim, I'm going to ask you first. I had the opportunity to try Brave Robot ice cream, which is it's excellent. It's a great product, and it was hard for me to understand how it was vegan, even though I know it's not made with animals, but it still has whey protein. So can you talk about reconciling that confusion for consumers?
Yeah, it's a challenge, especially for what we're trying to do, and what Ranjan's going to talk about is that how do you describe dairy that's not made from a cow, right? That gets very confusing, and the nice side of it is that it begs the question, and customers want to understand more. They want to understand more details about what it is and how it came to be, and it allows us to have that conversation effectively. But it is about creating the right language around the fact that it's microbial based, right? So there are other examples that already exist in the world. I mentioned chymosin or rennet that's used in the cheese industry, and when that's on the label, it says microbial derived rennet, right? And so there's a precedence for this, so that is very helpful, and we stand on those legs, right? And the ingredient itself says whey derived through I think we call it a flora-based protein is how we describe it. And we're always working on that. We want to develop the language that is going to stand the test of time, so that when customers are looking at this today or tomorrow and in 10 years from now, it's something that is coherent, right? It's a language, a lexicon that they can carry forward and they can talk to their kids about consistently, and that it's accurate, and we're not trying to hide anything. We talked a lot about all the partnerships that we have with different groups. Unfortunately, there's so much enthusiasm that's growing right now about this whole sector that those partnerships are very easy to grab a hold of right now because there's so much enthusiasm. But one of the things that we always ask and make sure that is in the language when we're licensing our product to other groups is that they are consistent in that language, right? That they're always referencing back to how this was made and where it came from, so that there's no dilution of that messaging. And that's really, really important. The third part of it is the regulatory side. So obviously the FDA has a say in terms of how we can talk about this. And fortunately, they do have examples of how that's been described. And so that's a conversation that's happening on multiple levels. And as long as we stay true and consistent to that, it seems to be going really well right now. The customers are liking what we're saying and how we're talking about it. It is confusing at first because it's dairy, but without the cow. But that's okay, and we're gonna keep working through those uncomfortable points because we have to be consistent in how we talk about it.
Mike, anything to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would echo the point that transparency and authenticity are key here. It's something that we all owe to each other and to our community. And I think you'll hear that message echoed across the board. I'd say the first thing that comes to mind when talking about acceptance here is really describing the benefit and having the benefit that the technology brings to be front and center, right? I think for many years, folks have looked at this sort of technology and said, well, what's in it for me? I think that sets a pretty high bar for us as an industry, especially working in food, where we have an opportunity to show just how good these products can be with technology that comes from microbial fermentation. And, Clara and Perfect Day are doing that. And we're pre-commercial, but we'll be doing that soon as well. So I think when consumers see that benefit and feel it and really believe it, then following up with a truly transparent and authentic conversation about how this works, people are more accepting today of technology in their food than at any other time, we believe. We need to honor that by telling the right story. But I think it starts with those benefits. How big can we make the benefit? How differentiated can these products be? And I think that sets a bar for us as developers and as an industry.
Great. And Ranjan, do you have anything to add on that topic?
Yeah, just one thing. We're talking about food. Food is so personal, so ethnic, so microclimate. So the terminology, demystifying terminology. An egg is an egg. If I call it as protein 1, 2, 3, you're creating more mysticism around it. So what I look at for the end use consumers or the upcoming generation, terminology, ensuring that the transparency and terminology all is built into the messaging so that there is not much of a mysticism around technology. We are using one of the simplest proven technology, as Tim and Mike mentioned, has been already there. And just think about insulin. Only a few decades ago, a lot of pigs were to be sacrificed to extract insulin, which today can be brewed in yeast fermentations. So giving analogies and demystifying technology definitely adds a lot of credence to what we really do. And I think in our case, in Clara, frankly, our logo says it all. It's an egg protein that we're making, eggs. And we're fortunate to be that our proteins are pretty simple in there.
I think one thing that's been interesting for us is, like so many proteins, whether it's soy or egg or dairy, they are some of the biggest allergens actually in the world, right? Because it's so widely consumed. And so on our packaging, you may have seen on the Brave Robot, it says contains dairy allergens, because the protein that we're making is identical to what you get from the cow. So if you have a dairy allergen already, it's likely that you may have that here as well. And so you have to obviously be concerned about that.
Sure, great point. All right, well, we're getting some questions in from the audience, so I'm going to turn to that. Let's see, I'll start with Mike on this question. Is there any difference between precision fermentation and recombinant DNA technology, biomanipulation, synthetic biology?
Yeah, I think there are components of precision fermentation, as is defined here, that involve elements of synthetic biology and bioengineering for sure. But I think this highlights one of the challenges and kind of must-dos for us in this industry is to get very clear on our terminology. But at the end of the day, the fermentation process is what produces the materials we're all talking about. It produces the ingredients that will allow for the future to deliver better options than exist today. Some of the tools to make that happen involve synthetic biology and for sure bioengineering. But again, that's part of the story that we need to be transparent about and how this is done. And I mean, the Nobel Prize for biology was just granted, or for chemistry rather, was just granted to the folks who discovered CRISPR-Cas, which is a really important tool in making all this happen. So, I think it's one of the few ways to do more with less in a resource-constrained future. And, it's important that we're all clear on how this works.
All right. So, okay, Ranjan, I'm going to ask you this one. A single egg or chicken breast contains numerous types of proteins and minerals that are necessary for appropriate digestion and absorbability. How does precision fermentation address the need to create a very complex protein profiles?
Yeah, I think the beauty of precision fermentation is essentially a reductionist approach. An egg is a very complicated thing all put together. And what we have done by precision fermentation is able to access the components that we need. So you can think about an egg going to a pound cake needs a different requirement than an egg going into a meringue. As an example, I don't need to have an entire yolk into another place where I just need the whites, egg whites. So fermentation, precision fermentation gives us that ability to access functionality, customized and designed specifically for the end use. So in many ways, that's the advantage. And of course, you can put it back together by complementing all these individual parts and creating the things you need. And that is why we say precision fermentation can avoid the salmonella that might come in as a part of the entire egg also. So this approach to control and design and specify the functionality that we need of an egg is what the value that precision fermentation gets on the table. And therefore, I would say, although the egg is completely nutritious, precision fermentation can also give you that nutrition by recombining the components that we need, and also the flexibility to avoid the components we don't need. And it is not only going to be cost competitive, but it's also going to be much more what I would call functionality accentuated on demand. So I can make specifically the meringue I need. I don't have to use the entire egg for that, as an example. I can make my pound cake. I'm allergic to, I don't just like the yolk. I just want egg whites. I don't have to sacrifice an entire egg to extract the egg white. I can make my own egg white in a fermentation process and not even deal with the yolk. So I think in that sense, precision fermentation gives you that platform.
Tim, what are some of the key sticking points for scale up with precision fermentation?
Yeah, I think this is really an interesting question because it's actually the reason why, 4 or 5 years ago when we started on this path that everyone said this was never going to work, right? So I mentioned earlier that we were standing on the shoulders of 40 years of technology where people are using this foundation for making enzymes. And those are really low use elements, right? Where they're using small amounts of those enzymes at key steps in either the food processing or in nutritional aspects of food, but also in your nutritional supplements that you might be taking, once a day or something in little pills and whatnot. So all those previous applications that were really making small amounts of material that they were charging a lot of money for, right? And the difference here is that we're making a large amount of protein that's being used as a large percentage in the food product, right? When you look at dairy, for example, 4% of that milk is protein. And then when you look at all the products that are coming from dairy, the protein is a fairly high amount of protein that's in there. And so that's really the breakthrough, right? Is can you make enough? We say that, the KPIs that you're generating, right, from a yield, from a productivity perspective, that are going to make this cost effective and competitive with what the cow can bring to bear. And that's really the big challenge here. In terms of really making this disruptive to where it becomes the obvious choice for companies globally, that this just makes sense, not only from a nutrition, from a safety perspective, from a renewable and greenhouse gas emissions perspective, but it also makes sense from their wallet, right? And we're crossing over that point now, that threshold where it is becoming certainly more cost effective from a premium category perspective and what we bring to bear. And it'll take a little bit longer for us to be completely competitive, where it absolutely makes no sense to use dairy proteins from a cow anymore, right? And so that's really the transition that you have to get through. So the fermentation process, right? All the challenges that you have to achieve there in achieving those KPIs, that yield and productivity, are really critical in making that successful. And so that's where kind of the magic is in our ability to do that. We can make, people have been making low levels of these proteins for a very long time. That's not hard. It's how do you achieve those large amounts, those large yields that are where you're generating tens of thousands of metric tons a year in a facility.
Thank you. We have a lot of global participants attending the symposium today, and I got a question from the audience here that asks, the companies on this panel are launching or have launched in the US market. Are there plans for foreign markets? And what are companies' concerns about launching in foreign production? Mike, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, Motif is pre-commercial, but we certainly have a vision for global scope in our business. A lot of it comes down to local demand. What kinds of products are trending in the marketplace? What are local regulations? But we think ultimately the plant-based movement is not confined to North America. I think for a lot of reasons you've seen a lot of growth in North America before you've seen it in other parts of the world. But for sure, I think you're going to see more and more expansion of this technology globally as companies like us and others figure out how to scale their business and how to leverage the opportunity overseas. But yeah, it's definitely a global opportunity, and plant-based eating has been a staple in a variety of cultures globally for a long time. That's not a new idea to a lot of consumers. So the consumer dynamics are definitely in our favor in other parts of the world too.
Tim?
We are operating obviously in selling in North America and in specific countries in Asia, where we've already gone through the food safety commissions in each country. And so that's obviously a first step before you can sell product anywhere. And there's a lot of other countries that have lined up, and we're in the process of going through that certification with them. COVID kind of has slowed down some of those things in some areas, and accelerated in different markets for different reasons. So it's kind of interesting. The pull is coming from all points across the globe. So in APAC, it's a food security and population issue. Europe, it's really an environment focus. In North America, it's really health conscious things. Those are the big factors that are kind of driving the interest across customer base and with the companies that are serving in those areas. So the pull is large and growing, and we just have to be able to make more.
All right, Ranjan?
Yeah, I think I just echo the same messaging that food is very distributed, is very local. So we in Clara have taken the approach of making ingredients. And these ingredients, just like eggs, can be utilized in different geographies, in different contexts, in different cooking styles or culinary experiences. So our approach is, again, although initial focus is in North America, we have in active collaboration discussions with many other multi-geographical institutes and companies so that we can make our ingredient accessible, because food access and price points in those regions does make a difference. So we have taken somehow a business and a technology approach together, trying to see how can we make the ingredients that we are making, which is egg white proteins, accessible all across, so that the cooking experience of replacing an egg from a chicken is undeterred. People can just use it. And that's the approach that we are taking right now.
And I think we have time for one final question from the audience. How are the big dairy companies like Danone, Arla, and Glanbia, et cetera, positioning themselves regarding potential disruption from milk made with precision fermentation? Tim, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question, and I'm laughing because obviously there's been a lot of interest from different dairy companies who actually make, who grow cows and actually make milk, but also large CPG companies that obviously use a lot of dairy to make products. And so it's been really fun because we've been working with both of those groups. And the large kind of dairy user companies, whether, Danone was mentioned as one of them, they're very excited about this because they've already dissected milk and all the proteins and then used them individually and seen the potential of doing that and creating new products and things that they can deliver benefits to the customer. And so they've already looked at that in great detail. It's just very expensive to do that when you're dealing with milk based products and the separation thereof. So seeing that we can do that, they already know the benefits of it. So their inbound interest has been very, very strong from the beginning, particularly from the R&D side, because they just see that the potential there is very, very big. Interestingly enough, even people who have cows, large companies, some of the biggest in the world that have cows, they've mentioned this, they see the writing is on the wall and they realize where this is going and they don't want to be left out. And so they really want to participate with us. And when we've let them try our protein and they put it through their process, their quality control processes, along with their dairy products that they make, they see that it works just like what they're familiar with, and that the benefits there are enormous for them in terms of how they could maybe be working with to create real plant-based products. A lot of them never even thought they would even consider making plant-based products because they just weren't that good in the dairy sector. But now, having worked with this, our proteins, they are seeing that this has actually been de-risked completely, and they see that there's a big opportunity there. So they see this as their way to get kind of back in and maybe cut down their long-term use of cows, which is very, very exciting.
Okay, I want to ask each of you one final question. As we think about the future of this technology, what excites you the most? What are what if we could do this with fermentation questions that excite you as you think about the future? Mike, let's start with you.
Sure, I see this type of microbial fermentation as really delivering a completely new toolbox of functionality to this industry, right? This is a means to an end, to give our community a set of technologies and tools that can help us create plant-based food forms that don't exist today, that couldn't exist because you simply don't have access to the right type of function in terms of functional performance as well as nutrition. So to me, this technology creates a whole palette of options and tools for us to get to that next level as an industry. So that's the most exciting thing for me.
All right, Ranjan?
I think for me, just thinking a world where there are less chickens than human beings will be awesome. And I think to me, that's the whole idea, that we don't have to be chicken farming, putting them into closed cages to access my egg. Just when I visualize it, it's just really exciting to be in this part of the technology that we're trying to drive here.
Thank you. And Tim?
You know, having lived through it with Beyond Meat and seeing the disruption and where you're starting to open up and change people's minds about how they look at what they can eat on a daily basis and the choices that they're making on a daily basis is incredibly exciting to me. And this is another extension of that, but it's even bigger because we can work across categories where our products can be used in a wide variety of applications. It's not just dairy, it's beyond dairy. And so there's a big opportunity here for disruption in a much bigger way. When I also think about tailored nutrition, I think that, and I think about how, as we go in the future and we start to understand more about the gut biome, this is a big opportunity where you can use these individual pure proteins to actually tailor that nutrition to the customer in a very big way. And that's hard to do when you're working with complex ingredients that have a lot of challenges in it. Dairy has lactose, right? Dairy has different allergens in it. And so we can actually tailor nutrition to different groups, to children, to different cultural groups, geographically, and across the different geographies. And there's a lot of opportunity here. So I think this is the beginning of the next big wave of if you call it disruption or just doing the right thing, we're doing it. So I'm very excited.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. I feel like we barely scratched the surface on this topic, but we've reached the end of our session. So please stick around for closing remarks from Caroline Bushnell and Bruce Friedrich. We'll be back in less than a minute.
Thank you to Monica and our panelists. What a great session to wrap up our programming today. Dairy without the cow and egg without the chicken. I love how this technology is really helping to reframe these categories. You know, it's just the same thing, but made in a better way. And this technology will help us achieve the great functional properties in these animal products, but without the animal, which is really incredible. As Mike said, it provides a toolbox of functionality. And as Tim just pointed out, the ability to tailor nutrition, which is so interesting. It'll also help simplify the supply chain. And, you know, this platform is well proven, as Tim pointed out, you know, using technology that's been around 40 years. I think it was interesting how the team pointed out, you know, that commercial partnerships are really going to be key to get these products to market faster. So we look forward to seeing more of those develop. And labeling is a question we hear about pretty frequently, but as the panel discussed, you know, rennet is produced in the same way. And so there's already a precedent there. was also excited to hear the goal to reach price parity. So I think it was said, so in dairy, for example, it just won't make sense to use cows. That reminds me actually of the Rethink X report on fermentation. If anybody hasn't seen that, I'd check that out. I think it's called Disrupting Food and Agriculture. And then finally, great to see the global focus, right? We know the shift towards alternative proteins is in no way limited to North America.